Hello and welcome back to Storytime. I'm just warning, I may cut the stream short because I've had a headache for the last couple of days, been very persistent. Hopefully that will not get too bad and I can do the two stories, the 2 hours that I planned. If not, I apologize ahead of time and I'll try to at least do the one whole one. I was realizing as I was reading this and also, watching some of the others, because there has been a lot of Sherlock Holmes movies, TV shows, and, the like. And it's interesting how a lot, especially with the more recent adaptations, they make Sherlock Holmes seem not very personable, like he's always very moody. And sure, in the books, I've noticed he does get a bit moody, but he also does have a personable side to him, like he laughs and stuff, which, and if you watch the Cumberbatch version, he doesn't really. And it kind of makes me a little reminiscent for the Basil Rathbone ones, which, of course, were the first ones that I watched, and I did like them, but the problem is that they made Watson look like a complete idiot, a blundering fool, bumbling fool. That's the word, a bumbling fool, which he is not. He is very smart in his own right. He was an army doctor, and so, he knows how to hold a firearm and all of that stuff. So, that's definitely my beef with the Basil Rathbone editions, but, they've definitely been getting him more correct in the more recent ones. Anyways, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So we have adventure number 15, The Adventure of the Yellow Face. In publishing these short sketches, based upon the numerous cases which my companion's singular gifts have made me the listener to, and eventually the actor in some strange drama, it is only natural that I should dwell rather upon his success than upon his failures. And this is not so much for the sake of his reputation, for indeed it was when he was at his wit's end that his energy and his versatility were most admirable, but because where he failed it happened too often that no one else succeeded, and that the tale was left forever without a conclusion. Now and again, however, it changed that even when he erred, the truth was still discovered. I have notes of some half-dozen cases of the kind of which The Adventure of the Musgrave Ritual and that which I am now about to recount are the two which present the strongest features of interest. Sherlock Holmes was a man who seldom took exercise for exercise's sake. Few men were capable of greater muscular effort, and he was undoubtedly one of the finest boxers of his weight that I have ever seen, but he looked upon aimless body exertion as a waste of energy, and he seldom bestirred himself save where there was some professional object to be served. Then he was absolutely untiring and indefatigable. That he should have kept himself in training under such circumstances is remarkable, but his diet was usually of the sparest, and his habits were simple to the verge of austerity. Save for the occasional use of cocaine, he had no vices, and he only turned to the drug as a protest against the monotony of existence when cases were scanty and the papers uninteresting. One day in early spring he had so far relaxed as to go for a walk with me in the park, where the first faint shoots of green were breaking out upon the elms, and the sticky spearheads of the chestnuts were just beginning to burst into their fivefold leaves. For 2 hours we rambled about nothing, in silence for the most part, as befits two men who know each other intimately. It was barely 5 before we were back in Baker Street once more. "Beg pardon, sir," said our page boy, "Beg pardon, sir," said our page boy, as he entered the door. "There's been a gentleman here asking for you, sir." Holmes glanced reproachfully at me. "So much for afternoon walks," said he, Has this gentleman gone, then?" "Yes, sir." "Didn't you ask him in?" "Yes, sir, he came in." "How long did he wait?" "Half an hour, sir. He was a very restless gentleman, sir, a-walking and a-stamping all the time he was here. I was waiting outside the door, sir, and I could hear him. At last he goes out into the passage and cries, 'Is that man never going to come?' Those were his very words, sir. 'You'll only need to wait a little longer,' says I. 'Then I'll wait in the open air, for I feel half choked,' says he. 'I'll be down before long.' And with that he ups and outs, and all I could say wouldn't hold him back." "Well, well, you did your best," said Holmes as he walked into our room. "It's very annoying, though, Watson. I was badly in need of a case, and this looks for the man's impatience as if it were of importance. Hello! That's not your pipe on the table. He must have left his behind him. A nice old briar with a good long stem of what the tobacconists call amber. I wonder how many real amber mouthpieces there are in London. Some people think a fly in it is a sign. Why, it is quite a branch of trade, the putting of sham flies into the sham amber. Well, he must have been disturbed in his mind to leave a pipe behind him, which he evidently values highly." "How do you know that he values it highly?" I asked. "Well, I should put the original cost of the pipe at around 7 and 6 pence. Now it has, you see, been twice mended, one in the wooden stem and once in the amber, which of these mends done, as you observe, with silver bands, must have cost more than a pipe did originally. The man must value the pipe highly when he prefers to patch it up rather than buy a new one with the same money." "Anything else?" I asked, for Holmes was turning the pipe about in his hand and was staring at it in his peculiar and pensive way. He held it up and tapped on it with his long, thin forefinger, as a professor might who was lecturing on a bone. "Pipes are occasionally of extraordinary interest," said he. "Nothing has more individuality, save, perhaps, watches and bootlaces. The indication here, however, are neither very marked nor very important. The owner is obviously a muscular man, left-handed, with an excellent set of teeth, careless in his habits, and with no need to practice economy." My friend threw out the information in a very off-hand way, but I saw that he cocked his eyes at me to see if I were following his reasoning. "You think a man must be well-to-do if he smokes a 7-shilling pipe?" said I. "This is Grosvenor mixture at 8 pence an ounce," Holmes answered, knocking a little out on his palm. "As he might get an excellent smoke for half the price, he has no need to practice economy. And the other points? He has been in the habit of lighting his pipe at lamps and gas jets. You can see that it is quite charred all down one side. Of course, a match could not have done that. Why should a man hold a match to the side of his pipe? But you cannot light it at a lamp without getting the bowl charred. And it is all on the right side of the pipe. From that I gather that he is a left-handed man. You hold your own pipe to the lamp, and you see how naturally you, being a right-handed, hold the left side to the flame. You might do it once the other way, but not as a constancy. This has always been held so. Then he has bitten through his amber. He takes a muscular, energetic fellow, and one with a good set of teeth to do that. But if I am not mistaken, I bear him upon the stair, so we shall have something more interesting than his pipe to study." An instant later our door opened, and a tall young man entered the room. He was well but quietly dressed in a dark gray suit, and carried a brown wide-awake in his hand. I should have put him at about 30, though he was really some years younger. "I beg your pardon," said he, with some embarrassment. "I suppose I should have knocked. Yes, of course I should have knocked. The fact is that I am a little upset, and you must put it all down to that." He pressed his hand over his forehead like a man who was half dazed, and then fell rather than sat down into a chair. I can see that you have not slept for a night or two," said Holmes in his easy, genial way. It tries a man's nerves more than work, and more ever than pleasure. May I ask how I can help you? I wanted your advice, sir. I don't know what to do, and my whole life seems to have gone to pieces. You wish to employ me as a consulting detective? Not that only. I want your opinion as a judicious man, as a man of the world. I want to know if I ought to, what I ought to do next. I hope to God you'll be able to tell me. He spoke in little, sharp, jerky outbursts, and it seemed to me that to speak at all was very painful to him, and that that his will, all through, was overriding his inclinations. It's a very delicate thing, said he. One does not like to speak of one's domestic affairs to strangers. It seems dreadful to discuss the conduct of one's wife with two men whom I have never before seen. It's horrible to have to do it, but I've got to the end of my tether, and I must have advice. My dear Mr. Grant Munro, began Holmes. Our visitor sprang from his chair. What? He cried. You know my name? Do you wish to preserve your incognito? Said Holmes, smiling. I should suggest that you cease to write your name upon the lining of your hat, or else that you turn the crown towards the person whom you are addressing. I was about to say that my friend and I have listened to many strange secrets in this room, and that we have had the good fortune to bring to peace to many troubled souls. I trust that we may do so much for you, do as much for you. Might I beg you, as time may prove to be of importance, to furnish me with the facts of your case without further delay? Our visitor again passed his hand over his forehead as if he found it bitterly hard. From every gesture and expression I could see that he was a preserved, self-contained man, with a dash of pride in his nature, more likely to hide his wounds than to expose them. Then suddenly, with a fierce gesture of his hand, his closed hand, there we go, like one who throws reserve to the wind, he began. The facts are, Mr. Holmes, said he, I am a married man, and have been so for 3 years. During that time, my wife and I have loved each other as fondly and lived as happily as any two that ever were joined. We have not had a difference, and not one in thought or word or deed. And now, since last Monday, there has suddenly sprung up a barrier between us, and I find that there is something in her life and in her thoughts of which I know as little as if she were a woman who brushes by me on the street. We are estranged, and I want to know why. Now, there is one thing that I want to impress upon you before I go any further, Mr. Holmes. Effie loves me. Don't let there be any mistake about that. She loves me with her whole heart and soul, and never more than now. I know it. I feel it. I don't want to argue about that. A man can tell easily enough when a woman loves him. There's a secret between us, and we can never be the same until it is cleared. Kindly let me have the facts, Mr. Munro, said Holmes with some impatience. I'll tell you what I know about Effie's history. She was a widow when I met her first, though quite young, only 25. Her name then was Mrs. Hebron, and she went out to America when she was young, and lived in the town of Atlanta, where she married this Hebron, who was a lawyer with a good practice. They had one child, but the yellow fever broke out badly in the place, and both husband and child died of it. I have never seen his death certificate. I have seen his death certificate. This sickened her of America, and she came back to live with a maiden aunt in Pinner, in Sussex. I may mention that her husband had left her comfortably off, and that she had a capital of about £4,500, which has been so well invested by him that it returns an average of 7%. She has only been 6 months at Pinner when I met her. We fell in love with each other, and we married a few weeks afterwards. I am a hop merchant myself, and as I have an income of 700 or 800, we found ourselves comfortably off, and took a nice £80 a year villa at Norbury. Our little place was very countrified, considering that it is so close to town. We had an inn and 2 houses a little above us, and a single cottage at the other side of the field which faces us, and except those, there are no houses until you get halfway to the station. My business took me into town at certain seasons, but in summer I had less to do, and then in our country home my wife and I were just as happy as could be wished. I tell you that there never was a shadow between us until this accursed affair began. There's one thing I ought to tell you before I go further. When we married, my wife made over all her property to me, rather against my will, for I saw how awkward it would be if my business affairs went wrong. However, she would have it so, and it was done. Well, about 6 weeks ago she came to me. "Jack," she said, "when you took my money, you said that if I ever wanted any, I was certainly to ask for it." "Certainly," said I. "It is all your own." "Well," said she, "I want £100. I was a bit staggered at this, for I had imagined it was simply a new dress or something of the kind that she was after. "What on earth for?" I asked. "Oh," she said in her playful way, "you said that you were only my banker, and bankers never ask questions, you know." "If you really mean it, of course you shall have the money," said I. "Oh, yes, I really mean it." "And you won't tell me what you want it for?" "Some day, perhaps, but not just at present, Jack." So I had to be content with that, though it was the first time that there had ever been any secret between us. I gave her a check, and I never thought any more of the matter. It may have nothing to do with what came afterwards, but I thought it only right to mention it. "Well, I told you just now that there is a cottage not far from our house. There is just a field between us, but to reach it you have to go along the road and then turn down a lane. Just beyond it is a nice little grove of Scotch firs, and I used to be very fond of strolling down there, for trees are always neighborly kinds of things. The cottage had been standing empty this 8 months, and it was a pity, for it was a pretty 2-story place, with an old-fashioned porch and honeysuckle about it. I have stood many a time and thought what a neat little homestead it would make. Well, last Monday evening I was taking a stroll down that way when I met an empty van coming up the lane, and saw a pile of carpets and things lying about in the grass plot beside the porch. It was clear that the cottage had at last been let. I walked past it, and then, stopping as an idle man might, I let my eye over it, and wondered what sort of folk they were who had come to live near us. And as I looked, I suddenly became aware that a face was watching me out of one of the upper windows. I don't know what there was about the face, Mr. Holmes, but it seemed to send a chill right down my back. I was some little ways off, so that I could not make out the features, but there was something unnatural and inhuman about the face. That was the impression I had, and I moved quickly forward and get a nearer view of the person who was watching me. But as I did so, the face suddenly disappeared, so suddenly that it seemed to have been plucked away into the darkness of the room. I stood for 5 minutes, thinking the business over, and trying to analyze my impressions. I could not tell if the face was that of a man or a woman. It had been too far from me for that, but its color was what impressed me most. It was the livid, dead yellow, and with something set and rigid about it, which was shockingly unnatural. So disturbed was I that I determined to see a little more of the new inmate at the cottage. I approached and knocked at the door, which was instantly opened by a tall, gaunt woman with a harsh, forbidding face. "What may you be wanting?" she asked, in a northern accent. "I'm your neighbor over yonder," said I, nodding toward my house. "I see that you have only just moved in, so I thought that if I could be of any help to you I will just ask you when we want ye," said she, and shut the door in my face. Annoyed at the churlish rebuff, I turned my back and walked home. All the evening, though I tried to think of other things, my mind would still turn to the apparition at the window and the rudeness of the woman. I determined to say nothing about the former to my wife, for she is a nervous, highly strung woman, and I had no wish that she should share the unpleasant impression which had been produced upon myself. I remarked to her, however, before I fell asleep, that the cottage was now occupied, to which she returned no reply. I am usually an extremely sound sleeper. It has been a standing jest in the family that nothing could ever wake me during the night. And yet somehow on that particular night, whether it may have been the slight excitement produced by the little adventure or not, I know not, but I slept much more lightly than usual. Half in my dreams I was dimly conscious of something that was going on in the room, and gradually became aware that my wife had dressed herself, and was slipping on her mantle and her bonnet. My lips were parted to murmur out some sleepy words of surprise or remonstrance at this untimely preparation, when suddenly my half-opened eyes fell upon her face, illuminated by the candlelight, and astonishment held me dumb. She wore an expression such that I had never seen before, such as I should have thought her incapable of assuming. She was deadly pale and breathing fast, glancing furtively towards the bed as she hastened her mantle to see if she had disturbed me, fastened her mantle to see if she had disturbed me. Then, thinking that I was still asleep, she slipped noiselessly from the room, and an instant later I heard a sharp creaking, which could only come from the hinges of the front door. I sat up in bed and rapped my knuckles against the rail to make certain that I was truly awake. Then I took my watch from under the window. It was 3 a.m. What on this earth could my wife be doing out on the country road at 3 a.m? I had sat for about 20 minutes turning the thing over in my head and trying to find some possible explanation. The more I thought, the more extraordinary and inexplicable did it appear. I was still puzzling over it when I heard the door gently close behind her, and then gently close again, and her footsteps coming up the stairs. "Where in the world have you been, Effie?" I asked as she entered. She gave a violent start and kind of gasping cry when I spoke, and that cry and start troubled me more than all the rest, for there was something indescribably guilty about them. My wife had always My wife had always been a woman of a frank, open nature, and it gave me a chill to see her sinking into her own room and crying out and wincing when her own husband spoke to her. "You awake, Jack?" she cried with a nervous laugh. "Well, I thought that nothing could awaken you." "Where have you been?" I asked more sternly. "I don't wonder that you are surprised," said she, and I could see that her fingers were trembling as she undid the fastening of her mantle. "Why, I never remember having done such a thing in my life before. Fact is that I felt as though I were choking and had a perfect longing for a breath of fresh air. I really think that I should have fainted if I had not gone out. I stood at the door for a few minutes, and now I am quite myself again." All the time she was telling me this story, she never once looked in my direction, and her voice was quite unlike her usual tones. It was evident to me that she was saying what was false. I had nothing in reply, but turned my face to the wall, sick at heart, with my mind filled with 1,000 venomous doubts and suspicions. What was it that my wife was concealing from me? Where had she been doing that strange expedition? I felt that I should have no peace until I knew, and yet I shrank from asking her again, after once she had told me what was false. All the rest of the night I tossed and tumbled, framing theory after theory, each one unlikelier than the most. I should have gone to the city that day, but I was too perturbed in my mind to be able to pay attention to business matters. My wife seemed to be as upset as myself, and I could see from the little questioning glances which she kept shooting at me that she understood that I disbelieved her statement that she was at her wit's end what to do. We hardly exchanged a word during breakfast. and immediately afterwards I went out for a walk that I might think the matter out in the fresh morning air. I went as far as the Crystal Palace, spent an hour in the grounds, and was back in Norbury by 1 o'clock. It happened that my way took me past the cottage, and I stopped for an instant to look at the windows and see if I could catch a glimpse of the strange face which had looked out at me on the day before. As I stood there, imagine my surprise, Mr. Home, when the door suddenly opened and my wife walked out. I was struck dumb with astonishment at the sight of her, but my emotions were nothing to those which showed themselves upon her face when our eyes met. She seemed for an instant to wish to shrink back inside the house again, and then, seeing how useless all concealment must be, she came forwards with a very white face and frightened eyes which belied the smile upon her lips. "Oh, Jack," said she, "I have just been in to see if I can be of any assistance to our new neighbors. Why do you look at me like that, Jack? You are not angry with me?" "So," said I, "this is where you went during the night?" "What do you mean?" she cried. "You came here, and I am sure of it. Who are these people that you should visit them at such an hour?" "I have not been here before." How can you tell me what you know is false?" I cried. "Your very voice changes as you speak. When have I ever had a secret from you? I shall enter that cottage, and I shall probe the matter to the bottom." "No, no, Jack, for God's sake," she gasped in an incontrollable emotion. Then as I approached the door, she seized my sleeve and pulled me back with convulsive strength. "I implore you not to do this, Jack," she cried. "I swear that I will tell you everything some day, but nothing but misery can come of it if you enter that cottage." Then, as I tried to shake her off, she clung to me in a frenzy of entreaty. "Trust me, Jack," she cried. "Trust me only this once. You will never have cause to regret it. You know that I would not have a secret from you if it were not for your own sake. Our whole lives are at stake on this. If you come home with me, all will be well. If you forge your way into that cottage, all is over between us." There was such earnestness, such despair in her manner, that her words arrested me, and I stood irresolute before the door. "I will trust you on one condition, and on one condition only," said I at last. "It is that this mystery comes to an end from now. You are at liberty to preserve your secret, but you must promise me that there shall be no more nightly visits, no more doings which are kept from my knowledge. I am willing to forget those which are past if you will promise that there shall be no more in the future." "I was sure that you would trust me," she cried with a great sigh of relief. "It shall be just as you wish. Come away, oh, come away up to the house." Still pulling at my sleeve, she led me away from the cottage. As we went, I glanced back, and there was that yellow, livid face watching us out of the upper window. What link could there be between that creature and my wife? Or how could the coarse, rough woman whom I had seen the day before be connected with her? It was a strange puzzle, and yet I knew that my mind could never know ease again until I had solved it. For 2 days after this I stayed at home, and my wife appeared to abide loyally by our engagement, for, as far as I know, she never stirred out of the house. On the 3rd day, however, I had ample evidence that her solemn promise was not enough to hold her back from the secret influence which drew her away from her husband and her duty. I had gone into town on that day, but I returned at 2:40 instead of the 3:36, which is my usual train. As I entered the house, the maid ran into the hall with a startled face. "Where's your mistress?" I asked. "I think that she has gone out for a walk," she answered. My mind was instantly filled with suspicion. I rushed upstairs to make sure that she was not in the house. As I did so, I happened to glance out of one of the upper windows and saw the maid with whom I had been speaking running across the field in the direction of the cottage. Then, of course, I knew exactly what it all meant. My wife had gone over there and had asked the servant to call her back if I should return. Tingling with anger, I rushed down and hurried across, determined to end the matter once and forever. I saw my wife and the maid hurrying back together along the lane, but I did not stop to speak with them. In the cottage lay the secret which was casting a shadow over my life. I vowed that, come what might, it should be a secret no longer. I did not even knock when I reached it, but turned the handle and rushed into the passage. It was all still and quiet upon the ground floor. In the kitchen a kettle was singing on the fire, and a large black cat lay coiled up in a basket, but there was no sign of the woman who I had seen before. I ran into the other room, but it was equally deserted. Then I rushed up the stairs, but only to find 2 other rooms empty and deserted at the top. There was no one at all in the whole house. The furniture and pictures were of the most common and vulgar description, save in the one chamber at the window of which I had seen the strange face. That was comfortable and elegant, and all my suspicions rose into a fierce, bitter blaze when I saw that on the mantelpiece stood a full-length photograph of my wife, which had been taken at my request only 3 months before. I stayed long enough to make certain that the house was absolutely empty. Then I felt it, feeling a weight. Then I left it, feeling a weight at my heart such as I had never had before. My wife came out into the hall as I entered my house, but I was too hurt and angry to speak with her, and pushing past her, I made my way into my study. She followed me, however, before I could close the door. "I'm sorry that I broke my promise, Jack," said she, "but if you knew all the circumstances, I am sure that you would forgive me." "Tell me everything, then," said I. "I cannot, Jack, I cannot," she cried, "until you tell me who it is that has been living in that cottage, and who it is to whom you have given that photograph. There can never be any confidence between us," said I, and breaking away from her, I left the house. That was yesterday, Mr. Holmes, and I have not seen her since, nor do I know anything more about this strange business. It is the first shadow that has come between us, and it has so shaken me that I do not know what I should do for the best. Suddenly this morning it occurred to me that you were the man to advise me, so I have hurried to you now, and I place myself unreservedly in your hands. If there is any point which I have not made clear, pray question me about it, but above all, tell me quickly what I have to do, for this misery is more than I can bear. Holmes and I had listened with the utmost interest in this extraordinary statement, which had been delivered in the jerky, broken fashion of a man who was under the influence of extreme emotion. My companion sat silent now for some time with his chin upon his hand, lost in thought. "Tell me," said he at last, "could you swear that this was a man's face which you saw at the window?" "Each time that I saw it I was some distance away from it, so that it is impossible for me to say." "You appear, however, to have been disagreeably impressed by it." "It seemed to be of an unnatural color, and to have a strange rigidity about the features. When I approached it, it vanished with a jerk." "How long is it since your wife asked you for £100? "Nearly 2 months." "Have you ever seen a photograph of her first husband?" "No, there was a great fire at Atlanta shortly after his death, and all her papers were destroyed." "And yet she had a certificate of death. You say that you saw it?" "Yes, she had a duplicate after the fire." "Did you ever meet anyone who knew her in America?" "No." "Did she ever talk of her visiting the place?" "No." "Or get letters from it?" "Not to my knowledge." "Thank you. I should like to think over the matter a little now. If the cottage is permanently deserted, we may have some difficulty. If, on the other hand, as I fancy is more likely, the inmates were warned of your coming, and left before you entered yesterday, then they may be back now, and we should clear it all up nicely. Let me advise you, then, to return to Norbury and to examine the windows of the cottage again. If you have reason to believe that it is inhabited, do not force your way in." Sorry. Now I've lost my place. If you have reason to believe that it is inhabited, do not force your way in, but send a wire to my friend and me. We shall be with you within an hour of receiving it, and we shall then very soon get to the bottom of the business. And if it is still empty? In that case, I shall come out tomorrow and talk it over with you. Goodbye, and above all, do not fret until you know that you really have a cause for it. I am afraid that this is a bad business, Watson, said my companion as he returned after accompanying Mr. Grant Munro to the door. What did you make of it? It had an ugly sound, I answered. Yes, there's blackmail in it, or I am much mistaken. And who is the blackmailer? Well, it must be this creature who lives in the only comfortable room in the place, and has her photograph above his mantelpiece. Upon my word, Watson, there is something very attractive about that livid face at the window, and I would have not missed the case for the world. You have a theory? Yes, a provisional one, but I shall be surprised if it does not turn out to be correct. This woman's first husband is in that cottage. Why do you think so? How else can we explain her frenzied anxiety that her second one should not enter it? The facts, as I read them, are something like this. The woman was married in America. Her husband developed some hateful qualities, or shall we say, that he contracted some loathsome disease, and became a leper or an imbecile. She fled from him at last, returned to England, changed her name, and started her life as she thought afresh. She had been married 3 months and believed that her position was 3 years, and believed that her position was quite secure, having shown her husband the death certificate of some man whose name she had assumed. Then suddenly her whereabouts were discovered by her first husband, or we may suppose by some unscrupulous woman who had attached herself to the invalid. They write to the wife and threaten to come and expose her. She asks for £100 and endeavors to buy them off. They come in spite of it, and then the husband mentions casually to the wife that there are newcomers in the cottage. She knows in some way that they are her pursuers. She waits until her husband is asleep, and then she rushes down to endeavor to pursue them to leave her in peace. Having no success, she goes again next morning, and her husband meets her, as he has told us, as she came out. She promises him not to go there again, but 2 days afterwards the hope of getting rid of those dreadful neighbors is too strong for her, and she makes another attempt, taking down with her the photograph which had probably been demanded from her. In the midst of this interview, the maid rushes in to say that the master has come home, in which the wife, knowing that he would come straight down to the cottage, hurries the inmates out at the back door, into that grove of fir trees, probably which was mentioned as standing near. In this way she finds the place deserted. I shall be very much surprised, however, if it is still so when he reconnoiters in the evening. What do you think of my theory? It is all surmise, but at least it covers all the facts. When new facts come to our knowledge which cannot be covered by it, it will be time enough to reconsider it. At present, we can do nothing until we have a fresh message from our friend at Norbury. But we had not very long to wait. It came just as we had finished our tea. The cottage is still tenanted, it said. Have seen the face again at the window. I'll meet the 7 o'clock train, and take no steps until you arrive. He was waiting on the platform when we stepped out, and we could see in the light of the station lamps that he was very pale and quivering with agitation. "They are still there, Mr. Holmes," said he, laying his hand upon my friend's sleeve. "I saw lights in the cottage as I came down. We shall settle it now, once and for all." "What is your plan, then?" asked Holmes, as we walked down the dark, tree-lined road. "I'm going to force my way in and see for myself who was in the house. I wish you both to be there as witnesses." You are quite determined to do this, in spite of your wife's warning that it is better that you should not solve the mystery? Yes, I am determined. Well, I think that you are in the right. Any truth is better than definite doubt. We had better go up at once. Of course, legally we are putting ourselves hopelessly in the wrong, but I think that it is worth it. It was a very dark night, and a thin rain began to fall as we turned from the high road into a narrow lane, deeply rutted with hedges on either side. Mr. Grant Munro pushed impatiently forward, however, and we stumbled after him as best we could. There are the lights of my house, he murmured, pointing to a glimmer among the trees, and here is the cottage which I am going to enter. We turned a corner in the lane as he spoke, and there was the building close behind us. A yellow bar falling across the black foremost showed that the door was not quite closed, and one window in the upper story was brightly illuminated. As we looked, we saw a dark blur moving across the blind. "There is that creature," cried Grant Munro. "You can see for yourself that someone is there. Now follow me, and we shall soon know all." We approached the door, but suddenly a woman appeared out of the shadow and stood in the golden track of the lamplight. I could not see her face in the darkness, but her arms were thrown out in an attitude of entreaty. "For God's sake, don't, Jack!" she cried. "I had a presentiment that you would come this evening. Think better of it, dear. Trust me again, and you will never have cause to regret it." "I have trusted you too long, Effie," he cried sternly. "Leave go of me. I must leave go of me. I must pass you. My friends and I are going to settle this matter once and forever." He pushed her to one side, and we followed closely after him. As he threw the door open, an elderly woman ran out in front of him and tried to bar his passage, but he thrust her back, and an instant afterwards we were all upon the stairs. Grant Munro rushed into the lighted room at the top, and we entered it at his heels. It was a cozy, well-furnished apartment, with 2 candles burning upon the table and 2 upon the mantelpiece. In the corner, stooping over a desk, there sat what appeared to be a little girl. Her face was turned away as we entered, but we could see that she was dressed in a red frock, and that she had long white gloves on. As she whisked round to us, I gave a cry of surprise and horror. The face which she turned towards us was of the strangest livid tint, and the features were absolutely devoid of any expression. An instant later the mystery was explained. Holmes, with a laugh, passed his hand behind the child's ear. A mask peeled off from her countenance, and there was a little coal-black negress, with all her white teeth flashing in amusement at our amazed faces. I burst out laughing out of sympathy with her merriment, but Grant Munro, staring with his hand clutching at his throat. "My God!" he cried. "What can be the meaning of this?" "I will tell you the meaning of it," cried the lady, sweeping into the room with a proud, set face. "You have forced me against my own judgment to tell you, and now we must both make the best of it. My husband died in Atlanta. My child survived." "Your child?" She drew a large silver locket from her bosom. "You have never seen this before?" "I understood that it did not open." She touched a spring in the front hinged back. There was a portrait within of a man, strikingly handsome and intelligent, but bearing the unmistakable signs upon his features of his African descent. "This is John Hebron of Atlanta," said the lady, "and a nobler man never walked the earth. I cut myself off from my race in order to wed him, but never once while he lived, did I for one instant regret it. It was a misfortune that our only child took after his people rather than mine. It is often so in such matches, and little Lucy is darker far than ever her father was. But darker fair she is my own dear little girlie, and her mother's pet." The little creature ran across at the words and nestled up against the lady's dress. When I left her in America, she continued, it was only because her health was weak, and the change might have done her harm. She was given to the care of a faithful Scotchwoman who had once been our servant. Never for an instant did I dream of disowning her as my child. But when chance threw you in my way, Jack, and I learned to love you, I feared to tell you about my child. God forgive me, I feared that I should lose you, and I had not the courage to tell you. I had to choose between you, and in my weakness, I turned away from my own little girl. For 3 years I have kept her existence a secret from you, but I heard from the nurse, and I knew that all was well with her. At last, however, there came an overwhelming desire to see the child once more. I struggled against it, but in vain. Though I knew the danger, I determined to have the child over, if it were but for a few weeks. I sent £100 to the nurse, and I gave her instructions about this cottage so that she might come as a neighbor without my appearing to be in any way connected with her. I pushed my precautions so far as to order her to keep the child in the house during the daytime and to cover up her little face and hands so that even those who might see her at the window should not gossip about there being a black child in the neighborhood. If I had been less cautious, I might have been more wise, but I was half crazy with fear lest you should learn the truth. It was you who told me first that the cottage was occupied, and I should have waited for the morning, but I could not sleep for excitement, so at last I slipped out, knowing how difficult it is to awaken you. But you saw me off, and that was the beginning of my troubles. Next day you had my secret at your mercy, but you nobly refrained from pursuing your advantage. 3 days later, however, the nurse and child only just escaped from the back door as you rushed in at the front one. And now tonight you at last know all, and I ask you what is to become of us, my child and me. She clasped her hands and waited for an answer. It was a long 2 minutes before Grant Munro broke the silence, and when his answer came, it was one which I loved to think. He lifted the little child, kissed her, and then still carrying her, he held out his other hand to his wife and turned toward the door. "We can talk it over more comfortably at home," said he. "I am not a very good man, Effie, but I think that I am a better one than you have given me credit for being." Holmes and I followed them down to the lane, and my friend plucked at my sleeve as we came out. "I think," said he, "that we shall be of more use in London than in Norbury." Not another word did he say of the case until late that night, when he turned away with his lighted candle for his bedroom. "Watson," said he, "if it should ever strike you that I am getting a little overconfident in my powers, or giving less pains to a case than it deserves, kindly whisper Norbury in my ears, and I shall be infinitely obliged to you." And that's the end of that story. We'll take just a little bit of a break so I can stretch and drink a little bit. How are you doing, by the way? I see we have one viewer. I saw that we had a few more drop in as well. Nice to see you, John. How's your weekend been? Nice. How's the weather over there? It's been getting pretty warm here, and I am not a fan of warm. Ooh, like reformatting how to possibly get a better graphics card, do more games. Yeah, I know, and it's just going to get a little hotter next week. I think here it's going to get up into the 80s, and right now it's in the 70s. I had to turn my fan on during the night because I was getting a little too warm. And of course my cat had to sleep on me and warm me back up. But I love him. He's very sweet. Oh, okay. Nice. Maybe improve the speed of its performance. That's pretty cool. I think I'm going to continue with the next adventure. Yeah, well, here's hoping it all works out really well for you. You know, having a nice refresher on a computer can be really nice. So let's go ahead and do adventure number 16, The Adventure of the Stockbroker's Clerk. Shortly after my marriage, I had bought a connection in the Paddington district. Old Mr. Farquhar, from whom I purchased it, had at one time in his had at one time an excellent general practice, but his age and an affliction of the nature of St. Vitus's dance, from which he suffered, had very much thinned out. The public, not unnaturally, goes upon the principle that he who would heal others must himself be whole, and look askance at the curative powers of the man whose own case is beyond the reach of his drugs. Thus, as my predecessor weakened, his practice declined until, when I purchased it from him, it had sunk from 1,200 to little more than 300 a year. I had confidence, however, in my own youth and energy, and was convinced that in very few years the concern would be as flourishing as ever. For 3 months after taking over the practice, I was kept very closely at work, and saw very little of my friend Sherlock Holmes, for I was too busy to visit Baker Street, and he seldom went anywhere himself, save upon professional business. I was surprised, therefore, when one morning in June, as I sat reading the British Medical Journal after breakfast, I heard a ring at the bell, followed by the high, somewhat strident tones of my old companion's voice. "Ah, my dear Watson," said he, striding into the room, "I am very delighted to see you. I trust that Mrs. Watson has entirely recovered from all the little excitements connected with our adventures of the Sign of 4. "Thank you, we are both very well," said I, shaking him warmly by the hand. "And I hope also," he continued, sitting down in the rocking-chair, "that the cares of medical practice have not entirely obliterated the interest which you used to take in our little deductive problems." "On the contrary," I answered, It was only last night that I was looking over my old notes and classifying some of our past results. I trust that you don't consider your collection closed?" "Not at all. I should wish nothing better than to have some more of such experiences." "Today, for example?" "Yes, today, if you like." "And as far off as Brigham?" "Certainly, if you wish." "Oh, Birmingham, sorry." "And the practice? I do my neighbor's when he goes. He is always ready to work off the debt." "Ha! Nothing could be better," said Holmes, leaning back in his chair and looking keenly at me from under his half-closed lids. "I perceive that you have been unwell lately. Summer colds are always a little trying. I was confined to the house by a severe chill for 3 days last week. I thought, however, that I had cast off every trace of it." "So you have. You look remarkably robust." "How then did you know of it?" My dear fellow, you know my methods." "You deduced it then?" "Certainly." "And from what?" "From your slippers." I glanced down at the new patent leathers which I was wearing. "How on earth—" I began, but Holmes answered my question before it was asked. "The slippers are new," said he. "You could not have had them more than a few weeks. The soles which you are at this moment presenting to me are slightly scorched. For a moment I thought they might have been wet and been burned in the drying, but near the instep there is a small circular wafer of paper with the shopman's hieroglyphics upon it. Damp would of course have removed this. You had then been sitting with your feet outstretched to the fire, which a man would hardly even do even in so wet a June as this is, if he were in his full health." Like all Holmes' reasonings, the thing seemed simplicity itself when it was once explained. He read the thought upon my feature, and his smile had a tinge of bitterness. "I'm afraid that I rather give myself away when I explain," said he. "Results without causes are much more impressive. You are ready to come to Birmingham, then?" "Certainly. What is the case?" "You shall hear it all in the train. My client is outside in a four-wheeler. Can you come at once?" "In an instant." I scribbled a note to my neighbor, rushed upstairs to explain the matter to my wife, and joined Holmes upon the doorstep. "Your neighbor is a doctor?" said he, nodding at the brass plate. "Yes, he bought a practice as I did. An old established one. Just the same as mine. Both have been ever since the houses were built." "Ah, then you got hold of the best of the two." "I think I did, but how did you know?" "By the steps, my boy. Yours are worn 3 inches deeper than his. But this gentleman in the cab is my client, Mr. Hall Pycroft. Allow me to introduce you to him. Whip your horses up, cabby, for we have only just time to catch our train." The man whom I found myself facing was a well-built, fresh-complexioned young fellow with a frank, honest face and a slight, crisp, yellow mustache. He wore a very shiny top hat and a neat suit of sober black, which made him look that he was what he was, a smart young city man of the class who have been labeled cockneys, but who give us our crack volunteer regiments, and who turn out more fine athletes and sportsmen than any body of men in these islands. His round, ruddy face was naturally full of cheeriness, but the corners of the mouth seemed to me to be pulled down in a half-comical distress. It was not, however, until we were all in a first-class carriage and well started upon our journey to Birmingham that I was able to learn what the trouble was which had driven him to Sherlock Holmes. "We have a clear run here of 70 minutes, Holmes remarked. "I want you, Mr. Hall Pycroft, to tell my friend your very interesting experience exactly as you have told it to me, or with some more detail if possible. It will be of use to me to hear the succession of events again. It is a case, Watson, which may prove to have something in it, or may prove to have nothing, but which at least presents those unnatural and outre features which are as dear to you as they are to me. Now, Mr. Pycroft, I shall not interrupt you again." Our young companion looked at me with a twinkle in his eyes. "The worst of the story is," said he, "that I found myself up as such a confounded fool. Of course it may work out all right, and I don't see what I could have done otherwise. But if I have lost my crib and get nothing in exchange, I shall feel what a soft Johnny I have been. But not very good at telling a story, Dr. Watson. But it is like this with me. I used to have a billet at Coxon and Woodhouse of Draper's Gardens, but they were lent in early in the spring through Venezuelan loan, as no doubt you remember, and came a nasty cropper. I had been with them 5 years, and old Coxon gave me a ripping good testimonial when the smash came, but of course we clerks were all turned adrift, the 27 of us. I tried here and tried there, but there were lots of other chaps on the same lay as myself, and it was a perfect frost for a long time. I've been taking £3 a week at Coxon's, and I had saved about 70 of them, but I soon worked my way through that and out to at the other end. I was fairly at the end of my tether at last, and could hardly find the stamps to answer the advertisements or the envelopes to stick them to. I had worn out my boots padding up office stairs, and I seemed just as far from getting a billet as ever. At last I saw a vacancy at Mawson and Williams, the great stockbroking firm in Lombard Street. I dare say E.C. is not much in your line, but I can tell you that this is about the richest house in London. The advertisement was to be answered by letter only. I sent in my testimonial application, but without the least hope of getting it. Back came an answer by return saying that if I would appear next Monday, I might take over my new duties at once, providing that my appearance was satisfactory. No one knows now how these things are worked. Some people say the manager just plunges his hand into the heap and takes the first that comes. Anyhow, it was my inning that time, and I don't ever wish to feel better pleased. The screw was £1 a week rise, and the duties just about the same as at Coxon's. And now I come to this queer part of the business. I was in diggings out Hampstead Way. 17 Potter's Terrace was the address. Well, I was sitting down doing a smoke that very evening after I had been promised the appointment, when up came my landlady with a card which had Arthur Pinner, financial agent, printed upon it. I had never heard of the man before, and could not imagine what he wanted with me, but of course I asked her to show him up. In he walked, a middle-sized, dark-haired, dark-eyed, black-bearded man, with a touch of the sheeny about his nose. He had a brisk kind of way about him, and spoke sharply, like a man that knows the value of time. "Mr. Hal Pycroft, I believe," said he. "Yes, sir," I answered, and pushed a chair toward him. "Lately engaged at Coxon and Wodehouse?" "Yes, sir." "And now on the staff of Mawson's?" "Quite so." "Well," said he, "the fact is that I have heard some really extraordinary stories about your financial ability. You remember Parker, who used to be Coxon's manager? He can never say enough about you." Of course, I was pleased to hear this. I had always been pretty smart in the office, but I had never dreamed that I was talked about in the city in this fashion. "You have a good memory?" said he. "Pretty fair," I answered modestly. "Have you kept in touch with the market while you have been out of work?" he asked. "Yes, I read the stock exchange list every morning." "Now that shows real application," he cried. That is the way to prosper. You won't mind my testing you, will you? Let me see. How are Ayrshires?" 106 1/4 to 105 7/8, I answered. "And New Zealand Consolidated?" 104. "And British Broken Hills?" 7 to 7 6. "Wonderful!" he cried, with his hands up. "This quite fits in with all that I have heard. My boy, you are very much too good to be a clerk at Mawson's." This outburst rather astonished me, as you can think. "Well," said I, "other people don't think quite so much of me as you seem to do, Mr. Pinner. I had a hard enough fight to get this berth, and I am very glad to have it." "Pooh, man, you shall soar above it. You are not in your true sphere. Now, I'll tell you how it stands with me. What I have to offer is little enough when measured by your ability, but when compared with Mawson's, it is light to dark. Let me see. When do you go to Mawson's? On Monday. Ha! I think I would risk a little sporting flutter that you don't go there at all." "Not go to Mawson's?" "No, sir. By that day you will be the business manager at the Franco Midland Hardware Company Limited, with 134 branches in the towns and villages of France, not counting one in Brussels and one in San Remo." This took my breath away. "I never heard of it," said I. "Very likely not. It has been kept very quiet, for the capital was all privately subscribed, and it is too good a thing to let the public into. My brother, Harry Pinner, is promoter, and joins the board after allotment as manager-director. He knew that I was in the swim down here, and he asked me to pick up a good man cheap, a young, pushing man with plenty of snap about him. Parker spoke of you, and that brought me here tonight. We can only offer you a beggarly 500 to start." "500 a year!" I shouted. "Only that at the beginning, but you are to have an overriding commission of 1% on all business done by your agents, and you may take my word for it that this will come to more than your salary." "But I know nothing about hardware." "Tut, my boy, you know about figures." My head buzzed, and I could hardly sit still in the chair. But suddenly a little chill of doubt came over me. "I must be frank with you," said I. "Mawson only gives me 200, but Mawson is safe. Now really I know so little about your company that—" "Ah, smart, smart!" he cried in a kind of ecstasy of delight. "You are the very man for us. You are not to be talked over, and quite right too. Now, here's a note for 100 pounds, and if you think that we can do business, you may just slip it into your pocket as an advance upon your salary." "That is very handsome," said I. "When should I take over my new duties?" "Be in Birmingham tomorrow at once," said he. I have a note in my pocket here which you will take to my brother. You will find him at 126B Corporation Street, where the temporary offices of the company are situated. Of course, he must confirm your engagement, but between ourselves it will be all right." "Really, I hardly know how to express my gratitude, Mr. Pinner," said I. "Not at all, my boy. You have only got your deserts. There are one or two small things, mere formalities, which I must arrange with you. You have a bit of paper beside you. Kindly write upon it. I am perfectly willing to act as business manager to the Franco Midland Hardware Company, Limited, as a minimum salary of £500. I did as he asked, and he put the paper in his pocket. "There is one other detail," said he. "What do you intend to do about Mawson's?" I had forgotten all about Mawson's in joy. "I'll write and resign," said I. "Precisely what I don't want you to do. I had a row over you with Mawson's manager. I had gone up to ask him about you, and he was very offensive, accused me of coaxing you away from the service of the firm, and that sort of thing. At last I fairly lost my temper. 'If you want good men, you should pay them a good price,' said I. 'You would rather have your small price than your big one,' said he. 'I'll lay you a fiver,' said I, 'that when he has my offer, he will never do so much as hear from him again.' 'Ah, done,' said he. 'We picked him out of the gutter, and he won't leave us so easily.' Those were his very words. 'The impudent scoundrel!' I cried. 'I've never so much as seen him in my life. Why should I consider him in any way? I shall certainly not write if you would rather that I didn't. 'Good, that's a promise,' said he, rising from his chair. 'Well, I am delighted to have got so good a man in my for my brother. Here is your advance of £100, and here is the letter. Make a note of the address, 126B Corporation Street, and remember that 1 o'clock tomorrow is your appointment. Good night, and may you have all the fortune that you deserve.' That's just about all that passed between us as near as I can remember it. You can imagine, Dr. Watson, how pleased I was at such an extraordinary bit of good fortune. I sat up half the night hugging myself over it, and next day I was off to Birmingham in a train that would take me in plenty of time for my appointment. I took my things to a hotel in New Street, and then I made my way to the address which had been given me. It was a quarter of an hour before my time, but I thought that would make no difference. 126B was a passage between two large shops which led to a winding stone stair from which there were many flats, let as officers to companies or professional men. The names of the occupants were painted up at the bottom of the wall, but there was no such name as the Franco Midland Hardware Company, Limited. I stood for a few minutes with my heart in my boots, wondering whether the whole thing was an elaborate hoax or not, when up came a man and addressed me. He was very like the chap that I had seen the night before, the same features and voice, but he was clean-shaven and his hair was lighter. "Are you Mr. Pycroft?" he asked. "Yes," said I. "Ah, I was expecting you, but you are a trifle before your time. I had a note from my brother this morning, in which he sang your praises very loudly. I was just looking for the offices when you came. We have not got our name up yet, for we only secured these temporary premises last week. Come up with me, and we will talk the matter over." I followed him to the top of a very lofty stair, and there, right under the slates, were a couple of empty and dusty little rooms, uncarpeted and uncurtained, into which he led me. I had thought of a great office, with shining tables and rows of clerks, such as I was used to, and I dare say I stared rather straight at the two deal chairs and one little table, which, with a ledger and a waste paper basket, made up the whole furnishings. "Don't be disheartened, Mr. Pycroft," said my new acquaintance, seeing the length of my face. "Rome was not built in a day, and we have lots of money at our backs, though we don't cut much dash yet offices. Pray sit down and let me have your letter. I gave it to him, and he read it over very carefully. You seem to have a vast impression upon my brother, Arthur. You seem to have made a vast impression upon my brother Arthur, said he, and I know that he is a pretty shrewd judge. He swears by London, you know, and I by Birmingham, but this time I shall follow his advice. Pray consider yourself definitely engaged. What are my duties? I asked. You will eventually manage the great depot in Paris, which will pour a flood of English crockery into the shops of 134 agents in France. The purchase will be completed in a week, and meanwhile you will remain in Birmingham and make yourself useful. How? For answer, he took a big red book out of his drawer. This is a directory of Paris, said he, with the trades after the names of the people. I want you to take it home with you, and to mark off all the hardware sellers with their addresses. It would be of the greatest use to me to have this. Surely there are classified lists, I suggested. Not reliable ones. Their system is different to ours. Stick at it and let me have the list by Monday at 12. Good day, Mr. Pycroft. If you continue to show zeal and intelligence, you will find the company a good master. I went back to the hotel with a big book under my arm and with very confident feelings in my breast. On the one hand, I was definitely engaged and had £100 in my pocket. On the other, the look of the offices, the absence of name on the wall, and other of the points which would strike a business man, had left a bad impression as to the point of my position of my employers. However, come that what might, I had my money, so I settled down to my task. All Sunday I was kept hard at work, and yet by Monday I had only got as far as H. I went round to my employer, found him in the same dismantled kind of room, and was told to keep at it until Wednesday, and then come again. On Wednesday it was still unfurnished, so I hammered away until Friday, that is yesterday. Then I brought it round to Mr. Harry Pinner. Thank you very much, said he. I fear that I underrated the difficulty of the task. This list will be of very material assistance to me. It took some time, said I. And now, said he, I want you to make a list of the furniture shops, for they all sell crockery. Very good. And you can come up tomorrow evening at 7 and let me know how you are getting on. Don't overwork yourself. A couple of hours at Day's Music Hall in the evening would do you no harm after your labors. He laughed as he spoke, and I saw with a thrill that his second tooth upon the left-hand side had been very badly stuffed with gold. Sherlock Holmes rubbed his hands with delight and stared in astonishment at our client. You may well look surprised, Dr. Watson, but it is his way, said he. When I was speaking to the other chap in London at the time that he laughed at my not going to Mawson's, I happened to notice that his tooth was stuffed into this very identical fashion. The glint of the gold in each case caught my eye, you see. When I put that with a voice and figure being the same, and only those things altered which might be changed by a razor or a wig, I could not doubt that it was the same man. Of course you expect two brothers to be alike, but not that they should have the same tooth stuffed in the same way. He bowed me out, and I found myself in the street, hardly knowing whether I was on my head or on my heels. Back I went to my hotel, put my head in a basin of cold water, and tried to think it out. Why had he sent me from London to Birmingham? Why had he got there before me? And why had he written a letter from himself to himself? It was altogether too much for me, and I could make no sense of it. And then suddenly it struck me that what was dark to me might be very light to Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I had just time to get up to town by the night train to see him this morning, and to bring you both back with me to Birmingham. There was a pause after the stockbroker's clerk had concluded his surprising experience. Then Sherlock Holmes cocked his eye at me, leaned back on the cushions with a pleased and yet critical face, like a connoisseur who had just taken his first sip of I don't know that word because some of the letter has been rubbed off. A vintage, I will say. Rather fine, Watson, is it not? Said he. There are points in which please me. I think you will agree with me that an interview with Mr. Arthur Harry Pinner in the temporary offices of the Franco-Midland Hardware Company Limited would be a rather interesting experience for both of us. But how can we do it? I asked. Oh, easily enough, said Hall Pycroft cheerily. You are two friends of mine who are in want of a billet, and what could be more natural than that I should bring you both round to the managing director? Quite so, of course, said Holmes. I should like to have a look at the gentleman and see if I can make anything of his little game. What qualities have you, my friend, which would make your services so valuable? Or is it possible that... He began biting his nails and staring blankly out the window, and we hardly drew another word from him until we were in New Street. At 7 o'clock that evening we were walking, 3 of us, down Corporation Street to the company's office. It is of no use our being at all before our time, said our client. He only comes there to see me, apparently, for the place is deserted up to the very hour he names. That is suggestive, remarks Holmes. By Jove, I told you so, cried the clerk. That's he walking ahead of us there. He pointed to a smallish, blond, well-dressed man who was bustling along the other side of the road. As we watched him, he looked across at a boy who was bawling out the latest edition of the evening paper, and running over among the cabs and buses, he bought one of them. Then, clutching it in his hands, he vanished through a doorway. There he goes, cried Hall Pycroft. Those are the company's offices into which he has gone. Come with me, and I'll fix it up as easily as possible. Following his lead, we ascended 5 stories until we found ourselves outside a half-opened door, at which our client tapped. A voice bade us come in, and we entered a bare, unfurnished room such as Hall Pycroft had described. At the single table sat the man whom we had seen in the street, with his evening paper spread out in front of him, and as he looked up at us, it seemed to me that I had never looked upon a face which bore such marks of grief, and of something beyond grief, of a horror such as comes to few men in a lifetime. His brow glistened with perspiration, his cheeks were of a dull, dead white of a fish's belly, and his eyes were wild and staring. He looked at his clerk as though he failed to recognize him, and I could see, by the astonishment depicted upon our conductor's face, that this was by no means the usual appearance of his employer. "You look ill, Mr. Pinner," he explained. "Yes, I'm not very well," answered the other, making obvious efforts to pull himself together, and licking his dry lips before he spoke. "Who are these gentlemen whom you have brought with you?" "One is Mr. Harris of Bermondsey, and the other is Mr. Price of this town," said our clerk glibly. They are friends of mine and gentlemen of experience, but they have been out of place for some little time, and they hope that perhaps you might find an opening for them in the company's employment." Very possibly, cried Mr. Pinner with a ghastly smile. "Yes, I have no doubt that we shall be able to do something for you. What is your particular line, Mr. Harris?" "I am an accountant," said Holmes. "Ah, yes, we shall want something of the sort. And you, Mr. Price?" "A clerk," said I. "I have every hope that the company may accommodate you. I will let you know about it as soon as we come to any conclusion. And now I beg that you will go. For God's sake, leave me to myself." These last words were shot out of him, as though the constraint which he was evidently setting upon himself had suddenly and utterly burst asunder. Holmes and I glanced at each other, and Hall Pycroft took a step towards the table. "You forgot, Mr. Pinner, that I am here by appointment to receive some directions from you," said he. "Certainly, Mr. Pycroft, certainly," said the other, in a calmer tone. "You may wait here a moment, and there is no reason why your friends should not wait with you. I will be entirely at your service in 3 minutes if I might trespass upon your patience so far." He rose with a very courteous air and bowed to us as he passed out through a door at the farther end of the room, which he closed behind him. "What now?" whispered Holmes. "Is he giving us the slip?" "Impossible," answered Pycroft. "Why so?" "That door leads into an inner room." "There is no exit?" "None." "Is it furnished?" "It was empty yesterday." "Then what on earth can he be doing? There is something which I don't understand in this matter. If ever a man was 3 parts mad with terror, this man's name is Pinner. What can have put the shivers on him?" "He suspects that we are detectives," I suggested. "That's it," said Pycroft. Holmes shook his head. "He did not turn pale. He was pale when we entered the room," said he. "It is just possible that—" His words were interrupted by a sharp rat-tat from the direction of the inner door. "What the deuce is he knocking at his own door for?" cried the clerk. Again and much louder came the rat-tat. We all gazed expectantly at the closed door. Glancing at Holmes, I saw his face turn rigid, and he leaned forward in intense excitement. Then suddenly came a low gurgling, gargling sound and a brisk drumming upon woodwork. Holmes sprang frantically across the room and pushed at the door. It was fastened on the inner side. Following his example, we threw ourselves upon it, and with all our weight, one hinge snapped, then the other, and down came the door with a crash. Running over it, we found ourselves in the inner room. It was empty. But it was only for a moment that we were at fault. At one corner, the corner nearest the room which we had left, there was a second door. Holmes sprang to it and pulled it open. A coat and waistcoat were lying on the floor, and from a hook behind the door, with his own braces round his neck, was hanging the managing director of the Franco-Midland Hardware Company. His knees were drawn up, his head hung at the dreadful angle of his body, and the clatter of his heels against the door made the noise which had broken it upon our conversation. In an instant I had caught him round the waist and held him up, while Holmes and Pycroft untied the elastic bands which had disappeared between the livid creases of skin. Then we carried him into the other room, where he lay with a clay-colored face, puffing his purple lips in and out with every breath, a dreadful wreck of all that he had been but 5 minutes before. "What do you think of him, Watson?" asked Holmes. I stooped over him and examined him. His pulse was feeble and intermittent, but his breathing grew longer, and there was a little shiver of his eyelids which showed a thin white slit of ball beneath them. "It has been touch and go with him," said I, "but he'll live now. Just open that window and hand me the water carafe." I undid his collar, poured the cold water over his face, and raised and sank his arms until he drew a long natural breath. "It's only a question of time now," said I, as I turned away from him. Holmes stood by the table with his hands deep in his trousers pockets and his chin upon his breast. "I suppose we ought to call the police in now," said he, "and yet I confess that I like to give him a complete case when they come." "It's a blessed mystery to me," cried Pycroft, scratching his head. "Whatever they want to bring me all the way up here for, and then— Pooh! All that is clear enough," said Holmes impatiently. "It is this last sudden move." "You understand the rest, then?" "I think that it is fairly obvious. What do you say, Watson?" I shrugged my shoulders. "I must confess that I am out of my depths," said I. "Oh, surely if you consider the events at first, they can only point to one conclusion." "What do you make of it, then?" "Well, the whole thing hinges upon 2 points. The first is the making of Pycroft write a declaration by which he entered the service of this preposterous company. Do you not see how very suggestive that is?" "I'm afraid I missed the point. Why did he want him to do it? Not as a business matter, but these arrangements are usually verbal, and there is no earthly business reason why this should be an exception. Don't you see, my young friend, that they were very anxious to obtain a specimen of your handwriting, and had no other way of doing it?" And why? Quite so. Why? When we answer that, we have made some progress with our little problem. Why? There can only be one adequate reason. Someone wanted to learn to imitate your writing and had a procedure to and had to procure a specimen of its first. And now if we pass on to the second point, we find that each throws light upon the other. That point is the request made by Pinner that you should not resign your place, but should leave the manner of this important business in the full expectations that Mr. Hall Pycroft, whom he had never before seen, was about to enter the office upon the Monday morning. "My God!" cried our client. "What a blind beetle I have been!" Now you see the point about the handwriting. Suppose that someone turned up in your place who wrote a completely different hand from that in which you had applied for the vacancy. Of course, the game would have been up. But in the interval, the rogue learnt to imitate you, and his position was therefore secure, as I presume that nobody in the office has ever set eyes upon you. "Not a soul," groaned Hall Pycroft. "Very good. Of course it was of the utmost importance to prevent you from thinking better of it, and also to keep you from coming into contact with anybody who might tell you that your double was at work in Mawson's office. Therefore, they gave you a handsome advance in your salary, and ran you off to Midlands, where they gave you enough work to do to prevent your going to London, where you might have burst their little game up. This is all plain enough. But why should this man pretend to be his own brother? Well, that is pretty clear also. There is evidently only two of them in it. The other is impersonating you at the office. This one acted as your engager, and then found out admitting a third... and then found that he could not find you an employer without admitting a third person into his plot, that he was most willing to do. He changed his appearance at first as far as he could, and trusted that the likeliness, which you could not fail to observe, would be put down to family resemblance, but for the happy chance that the gold stuffing of your suspicion would probably not have never been aroused. Hall Pycroft shook his clenched hands in the air. "Good Lord!" he cried. "Well, I have been fooled in this way. What has this other Hall Pycroft been doing at Mawson's? What should we do, Mr. Holmes? Tell me what to do." "We must write to Mawson's." "They shut at 12 on Saturdays." "Never mind. There may be some doorkeeper attendant." "Oh, yes, they keep a permanent guard there on account of the value of the securities that they hold. I remember hearing it talked of in the city." "Very good. We shall wire to them and see if all is well, and if the clerk of your name is working there." "That is clear enough, but what is not clear is why, at sight of us, one of the rogues should instantly walk out of the room and hang himself." "The paper!" croaked a voice behind us. The man was sitting up, blanched and ghastly, with returning reason in his eyes, and hands which rubbed nervously at the broad red band which still encircled his throat. "The paper, of course!" yelled Holmes, in a paroxysm of excitement. Idiot that I was! I thought so much of our visit that the paper never entered my head for an instant. To be sure, the secret must lie there. He flattened it out upon the table, and a cry of triumph burst from his lips. "Look at this, Watson!" he cried. "It is a London paper, an early edition of the Evening Standard. Here's what we want. Look at the headlines. Crime in the City, murder at Mawson and Williams, gigantic attempted robbery, capture of the criminal. Here, Watson, we are all equally anxious to hear it, so kindly read it aloud to us." It appeared from its position in the paper to have been the one event of importance in town, and the account of it ran in this way. A desperate attempt at robbery, culminating in the death of one man and the capture of the criminal, occurred this afternoon in the city. For some time back, Mawson and Williams, the famous financial house, have been the guardians of securities which amount in the aggregate to a sum of considerably over £1,000,000. So conscious was the manager of the responsibility which developed upon him in consequence of the great interest at stake, that safes of the very latest construction have been employed, and an armed watchman has been left day and night in the building. It appears that last week a new clerk named Hall Pycroft was engaged by the firm. This person appears to have been none other than Beddington, the famous former forger and cracksman, who, with his brother, has only recently emerged from a 5-year spell of penal servitude. By some means, which are not yet clear, he succeeded in winning, under a false name, this official position in the office, which he utilized in order to obtain moldings of various locks, and a thorough knowledge of the position of the strong room and the safes. It is customary at Mawson's for the clerks to leave at midday on Saturday. Sergeant Tucson of the city police was somewhat surprised, therefore, to see a gentleman with a carpet-bag come down the steps at 20 minutes past 1. His suspicions being aroused, the sergeant followed the man, and with the aid of Constable Pollock, succeeded, after a most desperate resistance, in arresting him. It was at once clear that a daring and gigantic robbery had been committed. Nearly £100,000 worth of American railway bonds, with a large amount of scrip in other mines and companies, were discovered in the bag. On examining the premises of the bodies of the unfortunate watchman was found doubled up and thrust into the largest of the safes, where it would not have been discovered until Monday morning, had it not been for the prompt action of Sergeant Tucson. The man's skull had been shattered by a blow from a poker, delivered from behind. There could be no doubt that Beddington had obtained entrance by pretending that he had left something behind, and, having murdered the watchman, rapidly rifled the large safe and then made off with his booty. His brother, who usually works with him, has not appeared in this job, so far as can at present be ascertained, although the police are making energetic inquiries as to his whereabouts. Well, we may save the police some little trouble in that direction, said Holmes, glancing at the haggard figure huddled up by the window. Human nature is a strange mixture, Watson. You see that even a villain and a murderer can inspire such affection that his brother turns to suicide when he learns that his neck is forfeited. However, we have no choice as to our action. The doctor and I will remain on guard. Mr. Pycroft, if you will have the kindness to step up for the police. So we've reached the end of our second adventure. Though we could possibly read a third one, I have had a headache for the last couple of days, so I'm going to end early the stream. I'm not going to do a game stream today just because it is my sister's and my only day off together. So we're going to spend that together. But tonight I hope to either do Midnight Minecraft or Midnight Mystery. So I hope that you will join me, and I will get this posted up on YouTube as soon as I end the stream. Thanks for hanging out with me, John. I'll see you next time. Bye. You too.